Okay, so chapter 10, A Changing Nation. And we're going to start looking at kind of a change in the way the government is structured. So we are finished. Yes, we're at the very tail end of our founding father presidents. After James Monroe, we have John Quincy Adams, and most historians do not consider him part of that founding father generation because he's the son of a founding father. But I kind of feel like he is the natural break between what comes before and then what comes after. Andrew Jackson is president after John Quincy Adams, and it is with Jackson's administration that some huge changes come in American politics. A lot of changes in what the executive branch is, and more stuff like that. So let's start with section 1. This is about building national identity. Before this point, we were mostly trying to survive, trying to get a government that worked. And now it's more of a question of what do we want our government to do? What is America? So our election of 1816 is won by James Monroe. The War of 1812 is over. The Treaty of Ghent is signed in 1814. James Madison finishes out his term in office. The people who run in the election of 1816 are James Monroe and the Federalist candidate, a man named Rufus King. Rufus is a great name for a dog, and I guess it could be cute for a person, but I just don't think of a President Rufus. I mean, I could be wrong. I probably will be wrong, but still. Monroe wins in a landslide. He gets 183 electoral votes against King's 34. So our Federalist Party here, that's pretty much the final national, like large scale election our Federalists run in. They hang on for a little bit longer, but any kind of influence that the Federalists have in Congress it's going to have to come from local elections. So there's no more of this national Federalist Party. It kind of reduces itself. So Monroe says, we're a post-war time. We need to promote unity. We need to get everybody together because remember, at the end of the War of 1812, we have the New England states they are very seriously considering seceding from the Union. So we already have states that are like, I don't know if, like, it's not you or it's not us, it's you, like you're the problem. So we're in it's shaky ground. And Monroe wants to have a goodwill circuit of the country. The only two states that didn't vote for him in this 1816 election were Connecticut and Massachusetts. And when he goes to these two states, they greet him warmly. It's like everybody is happy at this point. The arguments that they had over the War of 1812 no longer seem that valid. So at this point, we have a lot more national unity, people more willing to focus on improving the country instead of fighting about petty matters. When Monroe runs for re-election in 1820, there is no candidate that runs against him. He is independent of that. And I'm going to look up something very quickly on my phone because Andrew asked this question in class, and I did not know 100% what the answer is, so I'm going to look it up and see if I can find the answer. Sorry. I guess I should have music to play here. His vice president was a man named Daniel D. Tompkins. So there's that. John C. Calhoun was his. Hold on, let me look at that. Did I read it right? Yeah, it was his Secretary of War. That makes sense. Sorry, this is very boring. I know. It's not telling me what I need to know. Still don't care about that part. Okay. Yeah, okay. So he ran unopposed. That's what I thought. He ran unopposed. You had one chucklehead from New Hampshire that cast a vote in the Electoral College for John Quincy Adams. So he later comes out and says that the only reason why he had cast this dissenting vote was so that George Washington would have the honor of unanimous election. Whatever. So there. Because Andrew was like, well, was he unopposed, or was he or was it just that like there was no candidate that could oppose him? Because those are two different things. And I was like, well, you know what? I'm not really sure. I just always thought it was unopposed. Like I knew that, and then I never went and looked further. Now I have looked further, and I can say, Andrew, he was unopposed, and they just had one idiot mess up the Electoral College. So there we are. Okay. Back to the stuff you're actually supposed to be learning instead of, silence while I look up stuff. By 1815, Americans are starting to think about their government differently. And they kind of look at it and they say, I think our government should be a little bit more involved in the economy than they have in the past. Remember, Jeffersonian Republicans have this laissez-faire philosophy where the government does not get involved in the economy. And at this point, we have a shift going on in our Republican Party, and they're saying, no, maybe they should. Maybe they should work for economic prosperity in the entire country. That seems great. So now we have, it kind of starts in our general population, and it spreads up even into the Republican Party. Okay, Henry Clay, John C. Calhoun, Daniel Webster. We are going to talk about them on the next few slides because there are pictures, and boy, do I love early photography. This is Henry Clay. Isn't he a looker? All right, this is why you wear sunscreen, because look at that skin. And you can tell he was a blonde because he's got light eyes, and he's got, I'm sure his hair is gray at this point, but he wear sunscreen. Just that's what you need to take away from this. Okay, so Henry Clay was born in Virginia, and he is elected to Congress from Kentucky. I'm going to call all of these three people congressmen because at different points, they serve in both the House and the Senate. And so, in order to keep it straight, I'm just going to call him congressman. He runs as a Democratic Republican until that party, kind of changes a little bit. And eventually he is a Whig. He promotes things that people in the West need. And so keep in mind that when we're talking about West, we're talking about the areas roughly that constitute Ohio, Kentucky, Tennessee, Indiana, Illinois, and Missouri. Roughly that area. Obviously, we don't have actual lines today. It's not like somebody stands there and it's like, oh, that's Tennessee, that's Kentucky. But this region, it's in its infancy, and it's really trying to get settlers in there. It's really trying to have kind of a society for the people that are moving in there to be able to fall back on. And this was what Henry Clay wanted to do. He wanted to make improvements with his American system, which we're going to talk about in a second, and infrastructure. When I say infrastructure, I mean like roads, bridges, canals, things like that. It's stuff that just kind of seem to be places that you don't really think of, like, how did this get here? But the government usually pays for stuff like that. So this is what Clay wants to happen. He wants the government to work and put infrastructure into these Western states. Now, I know, I'm going to sit for a second because just the statement that John C. Calhoun makes in this photograph is amazing. And I will have to point this out because it might be my favorite part of this photograph is if you look here around his neck, that is hair. Yeah. So he has a clean shaven face, but there is this bit of hair that is either neck hair, which is gross, or chest hair, which might be a little grosser because that means it's that long. So, leaving you with that thought, John C. Calhoun was born in South Carolina, and he is a senator from South Carolina. He is the seventh vice president of the United States. And you're going to really hate that he was elected as vice president at some point because he's not a great guy. He speaks for the South. He really liked nullification. One of the greatest things, and I say greatest sarcastically, that he said was that slavery was not only good for the enslavers, but also for the enslaved. So there's that. At this point in time, however, what we need to know about him is that he does not like tariffs because they raise the price of goods. He says more for the South than for the rest of the country. Remember, the South imports just about everything. They don't have factories down there. They are exporters of raw materials. So everything that they get either has to be sent down from the North or it has to be imported from Europe. And either way, it's going to end up costing more. And he's like, look, we at least get to make it up if we can buy cheaper things from Europe. Why are you punishing us just because of where we live? This is Daniel Webster. He reminds me of a Muppet. And I think it's just because his face is severe. Anyway, he is from New Hampshire, but he represented Massachusetts in Congress. He begins as a Federalist, actually. So he's one of our few Federalist holdouts, but then he shifts to the National Republican Party once the Federalist Party is definitely no more. He likes tariffs, so he speaks for the North, and in the North, that's where they have the factories. So tariffs protect domestic industry, and he thinks that this is the way to go. We need to support our factory workers and our factory owners, really, and make sure that they're not put out of business just because Europe can undercut them. All right, so our first bank of the United States, it was established under Hamilton's three-point plan for getting the country out of debt from the war. It had a charter, and remember, a charter is a document that tells, a person or a company or an entity what it can and cannot do. So this charter had to be renewed every so often. Well, the charter runs out in 1811. And at this point, since we have Democratic Republicans mostly in office, Thomas Jefferson's argument against the first bank was it's not in the Constitution. You can't have this. So since we have all of these Democratic Republicans, or as your book calls them, Republicans in office, they're not going to want to renew this bank. And they're like, well, I don't know if we can do it. It's complicated. So they don't renew the charter for the first bank. As a result, the economy suffers a lot. Our state banks end up trying to take up the slack from the no longer in effect national bank, and they make too many loans. They issue too much money. It really throws the economy off kilter. A federal bank has the entire country to draw on for money, but with your state banks, it's a smaller population, and so it's much easier for these state banks to fold if something even worse happens. And of course, the even worse always happens. We have people spending more because they're, getting more loans. Prices end up going up because everything evens out eventually. So if I have $3 today and it's worth $3, but tomorrow it's worth what $5 is, prices are going to be crazy. So in order to try to fix this issue, Congress just says, let's have another bank. We'll do that. We'll have the second bank. So the second bank gets established with a new charter in 1816. It's privately owned. So at this point, it has investors. It's not like the government owns it. And in its charter, it says that it can operate for 20 years. So we're good. We have a good amount of time for it to run. Now, before the War of 1812, the American economy grows because it had to. Remember, we have the Embargo Act, which keeps any foreign goods out of America. America couldn't sell their goods abroad either. So it kind of is forced to. It has no other option. This gives American industry a good amount of time to kind of catch up with the rest of the world. But then the war is over and the Embargo Act is over. So the British factories and the British manufacturers that had been around a lot longer than the American ones also had more workers, so they could work more, they could work longer hours. They just have everything set up so that when they start dumping these products into the marketplace, they can undercut American manufacturers and American merchants by even less than what market price is. So if market price is $3 and that is the very least amount that your American manufacturers can sell things for, the British will come in and be like, okay, well, we're going to sell it for $2.50 because we have been established longer and we can absorb that loss, that temporary loss for all of the business that we're going to make overall. So this is what the British do. They dump all these products into the marketplace. And it causes a lot of New England businesses to fail. And then, people who have made investments in these businesses, they're like, wait a second, they did everything right. How can this business fail? And they turn to Congress. They're like, hey, Congress, you got to do something because, we can't do anything to Britain. They're doing what they can do. But you got to do something to help us out a little bit. Like this is your job. Your job is supposed to help us. So do that. Congress passes the Tariff of 1816. And this puts a tax on foreign textiles, iron, leather, paper, other stuff like that. And then in 1818 and then in 1824, they pass even higher tariffs. So the whole thought behind this is we are going to pass tariffs. And that way, if, maybe we can get the prices a little bit more even, and the additional price that these people are paying will go to the government and we can do something and help these people. Protective tariffs are popular in the North because that's where most factories are made. Again, in the South, tariffs are very unpopular. Calhoun says that they make Northern manufacturers rich at the expense of the South. Now, I would like to point out to John C. Calhoun, over 100 years after he died, the South doesn't pay for labor. So, anyway. Henry Clay, so the first guy we saw his picture, he comes up with something called the American system. Now, in Clay's American system, it proposes high tariffs on imported goods and a program of public works. He says that these high tariffs are going to help out the whole country because on the first hand, whatever that means, in the first place, a high tariff will force people to buy American-made products. And so if American-made products are being purchased, that is money in Americans' pockets who will then buy other American goods. And if it's a tariff and people choose to pay that tariff because they want the foreign product, well, that tariff money goes in the government's pocket. And then the government can turn around and do what it's supposed to do and have services for people. So they can build roads, they can build bridges, they can do things, they can have public works programs to improve the life of the ordinary citizen. However, it doesn't really work. We still have that kind of hands-off, don't want to do too much in the economy approach of our Republicans. Presidents Madison and Monroe, they don't really get behind some of Clay's projects. You also have our Southerners who are still angry about the tariffs, and they're not seeing how these high tariffs are going to help the South in the long run. They're like, okay, well, you want all this infrastructure built in the West. What if the South doesn't need it? Now, the South did need it. These people were just short-sighted, and we're going to see how short-sighted later on. And keep in mind, I am not acting like I would have done any better. I have generations of my family from the South, and they probably weren't that great of people. But, you know, it's modern day, so I get to sit in judgment. It's one of those things. All right, we're moving into some pretty important Supreme Court cases. And now I want you to keep in mind that, how do I explain this? Okay, so just because the facts of the case talk about one thing, that's not necessarily what the decision is. And I will explain. So, in McCullough versus Maryland, it has to do with the state of Maryland is trying to put a tax on the second bank of the United States. Yeah, that's as far into that as I'm going to go. I'm not going to give you too many facts. So Maryland is trying to put a tax on it. McCullough, the guy who is representing the bank in the state, sues and says, you can't do that. You don't have the authority to do that. Maryland says, yes, we do. We passed a law. Well, John Marshall, who is writing for the court, he says that states have no power to interfere with the federal government. Basically, that a state cannot pass a law that violates federal law. So the big thing you need to take away from here is that federal law always, always, always trumps state law. So the state can legislate as much as they want to, but if it's unconstitutional or if the federal government has a law completely negating that, then you can't do that. Like, it's always federal law. There are so many more nuances and subtleties to that, but just for our purposes right now, federal law trumps state law. All right, moving into Dartmouth College v. Woodward. This has to do with contracts. So the Constitution protects private contracts. This basically means if you and another party have gotten together and contracted on something, so set out the rules for, I don't know, something legal, something that is not so you can't sell a baby. That's illegal. But you can be, how does it work with surrogates? You're not selling the baby. You're selling like the baking. I don't know how to put this. The gestation. There we go. You're selling that. So you're not selling the actual baby. If it's not an illegal thing to contract for, then the government can't interfere in your contract just because they want to. This protects private business. Now, if it's an illegal act, then the contract is null and void, and you cannot go to the court system to have it enforced. But if it is for something legal, then the court can't just, say, no, we're not going to honor that contract. You have to honor the contract as long as it's not made illegal. This protects private contract rights, the ability to make a contract and have that contract carried out is important in capitalism. I'm going to stop rambling because I feel like I have said contract about 7,200 times, and I am really afraid I'm not making sense. So if you are listening to this and it's not making sense, please email me and say, Ms. Murphy, you were really tired when you made that video, and I have no idea what you were talking about. And I will say, okay, let's try this again. So our last court case is Gibbons v. Ogden. And this is another thing about federal powers that are given over in the Constitution. So it has to do with interstate commerce. And the ruling is that only the federal government has the ability to regulate interstate commerce. So yet again, we have the Supreme Court saying this is a power given to the federal government. States, sorry, it's not for you. All right, so that is the end of section 1, and I was going to record section 2, but I feel like I'm just rambling, so I'm going to save that for another day. All right, guys, thank you for listening. Again, if I am making no sense, please feel free to email me.